Now, for most feminists, who again I like to have as my respondents here, especially the most vocal, acknowledging women's vulnerability is playing right into the hands of who? The patriarchy, right? Do you guys even use that term around here? A lot of people do. So it's like suggesting that women ought to remain barefoot and pregnant or relegated to the kitchen. But there's a strain of feminists, as I mentioned, called care feminists, relational feminists, dependency feminists, for whom Carol Gilligan was, you guys remember Carol Gilligan, she was kind of one of the main first ones. For these feminists, human vulnerability is simply reality, okay? And it's a reality most worthy of our attention and deliberate response. Much like Catholics, these feminists see more clearly that vulnerability and dependency are inescapable facts of life. We are all inevitably vulnerable and dependent, or are caring for the vulnerable and dependent for much of our lives. No one, not even this phantom autonomous male, right, is autonomous for all that long, and certainly not autonomous by his own doing. As eminent philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre has noted, the responsible adult independence for which human beings properly strive requires the prior care and sacrifice of who? Of others, right? We do not acquire the virtues necessary for independence and flourishing on our own. So autonomy has become the primary goal in modernity and also in modern day feminism because of this post-Cartesian Kantian, so coming from Kant, situating of human dignity and worth in the human capacity to reason and will alone, unencumbered by pre-existing laws or purposes in nature, unencumbered by the constraints or laws of the human body. This forgetfulness of the body in which and through which the intellect reasons, as I mentioned earlier, it's deformed our understanding of the human person, of, I think, human reasoning too, but also of human dignity. And this is why this philosopher, MacIntyre, devoted an entire volume to exploring what it means to be a dependent, rational animal. And this is why your professor, Pat Lee, spends a lot of time on this question as well. Human embodiedness, our animal nature, gives way to human vulnerability, the characteristic that makes humans dependent upon others for much of our lives. This embodiedness, this dependency is really just as much a part of the human experience as the human ability to reason. Yet dependency has been neglected in much of philosophy, much of ethics, and this neglect has been particularly damaging to who? To women. Reason has taken up a lot of time, a lot of space, human ability to reason, taken a lot of space, and come on in philosophy. So human dependency is not some exception to be accommodated alongside the normal quest for autonomy and independence. Human dependency is part of the ordinary part and pattern of human life. And so human dignity, I would suggest, adheres in the human being, this bodily being, this dependent, rational animal. So human beings are different from other mammals in a number of important ways, but among the most important for our purposes today is the extended juvenile period in humans, longer than any other mammal. This long period of maturation in humans allows for the development of these virtues, right, needed for independence and flourishing, but it is costly and time-consuming to those giving care. Human vulnerability and dependency create the need for caregivers. Indeed, in a civilized society, the moral duty that some others give care. But caregiving greatly limits the caregiver's autonomy. So here is care feminist philosopher Eva Feder-Kitte. She's argued for the human dependent to really thrive, to reach a level of independence necessary for his own flourishing, it is morally incumbent upon his caregiver to truly, authentically care for the dependent and his often demanding needs, even if this comes at great sacrifice to the caregiver's own needs. I mean, that's true care, right? Is authentically caring for whatever needs are presented. That's true care, and sometimes it comes at sacrifice to the caregiver. As Kitte explains, the caregiver's caregiving status, her nurturing, her duty to love her dependent selflessly have now made her vulnerable, right? They've made her vulnerable and dependent, not to the full extent of the dependent, of course, but to such an extent that she needs the help of another who can provide for her needs while she selflessly cares for her dependent's needs. So according to Kitte, the caregiver needs what? A provider. Yes, this old-fashioned term is used explicitly by feminist Kitte. So more about providers in a minute. Now, women, of course, throughout all time, and in all societies are far more likely to be the primary caregivers of children and other dependents. So why is this? Well, the feminist line by and large is that this is due to social construction. This is what the powers that be, the men, have wanted it, and so this is how it's been and continues to be. But social construction doesn't account for the large percentage of highly educated women in today's rather egalitarian society who leave their impressive careers to return home to care for their children entirely or at least part-time. It doesn't account for liberated women, right, who want to endure the sacrifice of giving care. So this theory of social construction ultimately can't make sense of this all because it neglects human embodiment. I mean, this is sort of obvious, right? But the vulnerable human being enters the world how? Inside his mother's body, his body within her body. Indeed, her body naturally provides complete nourishment for his body when he emerges from the womb, and for several months, and for some people, well, not complete nourishment for several years, but some nourishment too for several years thereafter, obviously in the in breast milk. Mothers, by definition, are the custodians of vulnerable human life. Indeed, because the unborn human being is dependent upon its mother in an exclusive way, such that only she can meet the unborn child's needs, mothers have a special, affirmative duty of care to nurture the unborn child, never to destroy it. But in bearing new life and in sacrificing their autonomy to care for this life, and this is where this feminist Kitte's insights become poignant, mothers too become vulnerable. In caring for those who are specially dependent upon them, they too become dependent. And their own dependency makes them vulnerable to exploitation and domination by others, especially upon those upon whom they rely for support. So most care feminists who have done the thinking about vulnerability and dependency and caregiving acknowledge that women historically have done much of the care and still do to this day. And even though they may think that these desires may be due to social construction instead of women's nature or something like that, these particular feminists, these care feminists, they do acknowledge that some women, most women even, enjoy giving care. As a result, this group of feminists, like John Paul the Great in his writings on women, if any of you have read these, they are eager, both groups, right, John Paul II and these care feminists, are eager to give care, to see caregiving work valued for the essential contribution it makes to society. They, like John Paul II, want workplaces and the culture at large to better support and value the essential work of caregiving. And finally, like the great saint, these feminists look to urge men to join women in the great and essential work of caregiving. And in my experience, Catholic men tend to take this care work in the family very seriously. So the flourishing of society depends upon those who willingly undertake the care of the next generation. It is incumbent, I think, upon society, and we can talk about what that might look like, but it's incumbent upon society to respect, honor, and support caregiving work. So though care feminists are cautious of valorizing motherhood the way the church does, right, in the person of Mary, I mean, we very much valorize motherhood, and these care feminists are inexplicably in favor of abortion. I mean, this is really the part that I find most incredible in light of a lot of their writing. Some have referred to abortion as a responsible parenting decision. And again, we can talk about that because I've read a lot of that if you're interested. But these feminists are eager to shore up motherhood, support for motherhood, in a way that autonomy feminists like, say, Justice Ginsburg are not. And so I'm very thankful for their cutting edge work in this regard. But most care feminists do not see a differentiated role for fathers. Okay, so now we're going to talk a bit about fatherhood. So, sorry, I keep tapping my microphone. So on their view, if men are going to be involved, which of course they hope that they will be, then they ought to step into the nurturing role and take over a piece of the caregiving work traditionally performed by women. This frees women up to participate in the workplace and allows men to experience the merits of caregiving for themselves and for their children. In some cases, this care sharing, maybe we could call it, works very well. I, like many of the professional women in this room, I presume am grateful for the hands-on role that my husband plays in caring and helping to care for our 6 children, and he and my children are better for it. But the peculiar part of all of this is that Kitte thinks what these men are doing, they're mothering, she says. That is, mothering or caregiving, she uses these two terms, either one is fine, right? Mother or caregiving can be done by women or men. To wit, she says, men can be mothers. It follows from this reasoning that two women or even two men can adequately raise a child just as well as a man or a woman. So long as the caregiver gets the support she needs in her caregiving, the sex, or gender as it's called these days, of the caregiver doesn't really matter. Two parents are better than one in meeting the needs of the children. Two parents have more resources to offer. And indeed, if they are thoughtful about it, they say, these non-gender specific parents can just as well contract out the caregiving role to another altogether. Thus the push for high quality universal daycare among all feminists. And if there's no spouse to support the caregiver, the provider may just as well be a generous welfare state. And so here's where I disagree with the care feminists, and the disagreement really is as crucial as the agreement. For these feminists, fathers can and should stand in for the mother in this vertical relationship between mother and child. But the father's manness does not make any unique contribution in this view to the healthy upbringing of the child. Indeed, in their view, I think, the father qua father is anathema. His traditional role as sole provider worked only to compound the traditional mother's vulnerability as caregiver, because in exclusively providing for her needs, she was put in this far weaker position of relational power. This inequality gave him power to dominate over her. Thus, the women's movement, thus the view that traditional marriage is inherently bad for women, thus the assumption that women must maintain some work outside the home so she does not become too financially dependent on the one who may dominate or desert her. So inasmuch as I agree that men can and should be nurturing, and that at some may even succeed as the primary caregivers of their children. I don't know if Steubenville has any stay-at-home dads. I also think that fathers have a unique and distinctive role. Fathers are not just second-rate mothers, which is often how they're portrayed, right? I actually had someone after just recently after I wrote, in response to the CNN article I wrote, which is along the lines of this, just in a really short version. He sent me an article that I just read this morning on the way here about maternal chauvinism, okay? And that's basically this view that among feminists and among a lot of people, especially women, especially those looking for equal rights in the workplace for women, that women want to hold on to their ability to sort of answer the baby's cries. They like to be that primary response to the primary caregiver, basically, you know. So he says, you know, we fathers want to be more involved, but you women are keeping us out from being involved, right? Because you just want to elbow us out of housework and out of childcare and all these things. You just want to do that by yourself. Now, that's not me, so I don't know who she's talking about. You want to help? Great. Here's what you got to do. And in my family, it's not even like that. You don't even ask him. He just does it. I mean, we're just, you know. But anyway, apparently there's this group, you know, this writer's accusing of being maternal chauvinist. Anyway, so fathers are not just second-rate mothers. So I want to return to the body now to sort of understand why this may be the case. So when we start with the body, and so with vulnerability and dependency, we come upon what I think is an interesting sequence. So the quintessential vulnerable person is the child, and the mother stands in immediate vertical relationship as custodian of the vulnerable child. In the first place, when the child's body is in the mother's own body. Now, the father qua father stands not in relation to the child with that sort of maternal immediacy, right? But he does stand in immediate relation, say horizontally, with who? With the mother, right? The father is known through the mother because the two have had relations. The father, now just in terms of biology here, stands at some distance from the infant child. This is, of course, the reproductive autonomy I referred to earlier, that which modern day autonomy feminists have sought to imitate, right? They want to be over here, you know, detached from the child. But if the manness of man does not matter to the healthy upbringing of the child, there seems to be, if you just look at biology, no unique role for the father. At first glance, the body tells us that man can at some level remain autonomous. He can be financial provider or stand-in mother should he so choose, or he can donate his sperm and go play video games as far as anyone is concerned. The father qua father, right, is not all that necessary. But that can't be right. Well, why not? First, because a large amount of sociological data shows us that the absence of the biological father has a strikingly deleterious impact on his children, on his girls, but now we're seeing new studies are showing more and more on his boys. Secondly, because a woman's happiness in her mothering depends upon the emotional attention both she and the children receive from the father. As a corollary, the father's relationship with his children generally depends on the health of the prior relationship he has with the mother. So his active engagement in the children's lives is unique and necessary to their development, but so is the love he has for their mother. And the latter is often a prerequisite for the former. I'm going to go through this. So the third reason, because men need to be fathers, good fathers, attentive fathers, for their very own well-being and for that of society at large. So I'm going to go through each of these 3 points. First, the data. So where do we stand after this large-scale family fragmentation we've seen over the last 40 years? Again, 40% of children are born to unwed mothers, upward of 70% in African-American homes. So today we see relatively active mothers and often absent fathers. This in itself, I think, testifies to this stubborn maternal embrace of dependence, even when doing so requires much and comes at great sacrifice for these women. But the absence of fathers has been devastating for the children. Study upon study reveals the following. Children who grow up in a home without their own father are far more likely to end up in poverty, suffer neglect and abuse, use drugs and alcohol, drop out of school. Boys show levels of aggressive behavior and are more likely to commit crimes. Girls are more likely to engage in early sexual activity and become pregnant as adolescents. So recently, as I mentioned, researchers have reported that sons raised by single mothers fare even worse than daughters in the same situation. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat has noticed the compounding effect, or you could say the negative feedback loop this problem presents, wherein a boy raised without their fathers are unlikely to ever grow up to be marriageable men themselves, locking in, Douthat says, a world where boys don't have fathers around to model masculinity and a dating scene where women don't have enough plausible mates to choose from. There's another, a woman at the Brookings Institute, which is a liberal think tank, Elizabeth Sawhill, I think is her name. But she also says, well, counter to that, women are also not that marriageable anymore either, especially in poor areas, disadvantaged areas. Why is that? Because they have children from other men. And most men don't want to marry a woman who has children from one man, two men, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of unmarriageable people around, especially in a population which really needs marriage, because marriage is a wealth producer, an income producer. So while some mourn the loss of the father in the lives of children, others, as we've seen, are anxious to replace the father with a generic provider, even if that be state financial and other assistance to the mother. But welfare assistance and universal daycare, no matter how generous, cannot provide mothers with the emotional supports they need to mother their children and flourish while doing so. So this is point 2 in my 3 points. So University of Virginia sociologist Brad Wilcox has shown the most important determinant in the mother's well-being, and in that, the most important determinant of a mother's happiness is the father's commitment and emotional investment in the mother's well-being and in that of their children. That is, committed, emotionally invested husbands and fathers make for the happiest wives and mothers. Moreover, and this is the key here, the father who's in a good relationship with the mother is also far more likely to have children who are healthier, both psychologically and emotionally. So Wilcox says, quote, one of the most important influences a father can have on his children is indirect. Fathers influence their children in large part through the quality of the relationship they have with the mother of their children. So knowing all this, let's look again at what we know from the body. So mothers have this immediate relationship with the vulnerable child. Father's relationship with his children begins, as Wilcox says, as an indirect, secondary relationship, we might say, to the primary mating relationship he has with the mother of the children. So for fathers to reach their children, which is necessary for both the mother and the children to thrive, fathers must focus, as a matter of priority, we could say, on ensuring a strong and healthy relationship with the children's mother. So this insight may be what John Paul II meant when he said, fathers learn their fatherhood from the mother of their child. So we see this play out after divorce, when the quality of the spousal relationship, right, that broken spousal relationship, actually affects father's investment in the children far more than it affects mother's investment in their children. So this is quoting from some family research. Quote, "While divorce rarely weakens a mother's affection for her children, it does frequently result in deterioration of the father-child relationship." And here's another study. When men are in an unhappy marital relationship, they tend to withdraw from their children as well as their spouse. Now, this is not at all to say that fathers are not as necessary as mothers. And importantly, the father's role with the children is also direct. I'm not saying it's only indirect. And we're going to get to that. But it is to say that the essential role of the father in the lives of the children depends upon a prior commitment of father to mother, or more properly, husband to wife. After all, where mothers are attached to children by birth, it is the institution of marriage that is the cultural means of attaching fathers to mothers and to children. Thus, among the most important of the father's unique roles is that he loves and respects his children's mother, and that he demands that the children love and respect her as well. Now again, please don't misunderstand. So just as a father can love and nurture his child, but ought not be considered as a second fiddle mother, a father is not only a support for the mother, as though mothers with paternal support were all that a child needed. The father's active presence to the child itself is also necessary. So I want to say it's necessary, but just not sufficient. While the data on the consequences of the father's absence is far more abundant than the data showing the precise mechanism by which a father directly contributes to his child's well-being, that data is growing. And please, if there's anybody who wants to go into research, it's a really important area of data, is that father's particular influence on the children. Fathers who are attentive and caring presence in their children's lives have much better educational outcomes overall. Attentive fathers seem to be a determining factor in the social and emotional well-being of their children, with these children showing more emotional security, confidence in exploring the world, ability to deal with social stresses, and better social connections among peers. Researchers point to fathers' propensity to engage their infants, and especially their preschoolers, in stimulating rough and tumble play as the reason for their children's superior ability to regulate their feelings and behavior. When Pat and I were emailing back and forth, he gave the example of, a child being thrown up in the air. Well, and then another parent saying, "No, be careful." Now, which one is which? I mean, we know which parent is which in that situation. Boys with attentive fathers have better impulse control, studies show us. And fathers, more than mothers, tend to encourage children to do things for themselves at a young age with an eye toward ensuring their competence and confidence in the world later in life. I mean, our perfect example in my house is the park was half a mile away, and the little kids would walk. And I'd say, "We got to take the wagon." And he'd say, "No, they're walking." "No, we got to take the wagon." "No, they're walking." Of course, I always won, and he said, "And that's greatly to our detriment," or their detriment now, right? They should have just walked. But this would be, this interplay. So if the mother's initial immediacy to the child provides this important custodial care and benefit to the child's emotional and physical needs, I think that the father's relative distance from the infant child itself plays an important role. The father's attention and affection offered to the child, since of course it is his child, gives the child the confidence he needs to what? To separate from the mother's abode and to teach the child to push his own limits in that essential human maturation process toward independence. Both custodial care and nudges toward independence are necessary to child's development, right? Both are needed. Now, at some age, depending on the temperament and the social situation outlook of the individual mother and father, maybe the cultural expectations in which they parent, these highly gendered tendencies may become less explicit as the child grows. So, I go out and play soccer with my kids all the time because I'm a soccer player, and my husband cooks with my kids all the time. I mean, these gendered things aren't, but in those infant years, in those early years when the child development is so critical, these embodied realities tend to prevail, okay? And again, I just think that there should be more research on this paternal role. Now, just as children need their fathers for their proper maturation, that is, they need the father both to be the father's presence, and they need their father to love their mother. It is my contention that men need to be fathers for their own flourishing. So this is point 3 in those 3, and this will be my last point. So not necessarily physical fathers, mind you, but spiritual fatherhood is definitely a subject for an entirely different talk. So with George Gilder and others, George Gilder wrote a book called Men and Marriage, which is just a classic that anybody interested in any of this kind of stuff should read. I believe that men need to orient their characteristic aggression and competitiveness, their superior physical strength and intrinsic desire for conquest in service of the vulnerable. When we take the body seriously, as we have tried to today, we see the role of the mother as custodian quite readily. The role of the father is harder to discern beyond his biological contribution. He stands in immediate relation to the woman, and he can stay or he can go. He can attend to her and their children, or he can abandon them and spread his seed elsewhere. Sorry to be crude, but biology ultimately doesn't decide. So it is a child-centered, a woman-centered culture, a chivalrous culture, a culture that believes in the moral duty to care for the vulnerable, that demands that the father stay, that the father be a father. This sort of culture requires that man turn his intrinsic desire for conquest, a desire that unmet today gives way to gangs and gamers, inward to conquer himself. His desire to dominate others, born of the testosterone driving through his body, must become a desire to dominate himself and his passions. His primal need to spread his seed, to sire as many offspring as possible, this is from evolutionary biologists, right? They talk about this kind of primal tendency, must be turned inward toward bodily mastery of lust. In Asian cultures where men greatly outnumber women, why? Because they aborted all the girls. Not all, but male aggression threatens to overtake civilized society. On the other hand, testosterone levels drop when males become fathers, and they drop even more when men are attentive fathers, the studies show. This self-possession that fatherhood properly requires vitiates against external acts of aggression, so long as the man both recognizes and is supported in his vocation to master himself for the good of his wife and children. So Rousseau, I think, was right that woman has a civilizing effect on man, but it isn't because of a woman's natural virtue. She can be vicious too, but because of sexual asymmetry. Woman's experience in vulnerability and dependency in reproduction and caregiving make her more in tune with the vulnerable and dependent. This is the feminine genius that John Paul II spoke of, that ability to see the dignity and value of each person regardless of his or her utility. I'm seeing that I've gone on far too long. So I just want to just say that, when we give pride of place to the vulnerable, as the churches want to do, especially I think in the person of Pope Francis these days, the woman is really the place of abode, so to speak, where all the action, the sacred, wondrous, life-giving action is. And man finds a purpose for his body's power and aggression when it is put in service of the vulnerable and those who care for them.
How many of you have heard about Bishop Oliver Dome? Anybody? No way. This is Franciscan University, bro. You guys don't know about this guy? Okay, I'm surprised. I think you're going to know him. You just probably don't know the name. Okay, so in December of 2014, so just a couple years ago, in Nigeria. Now, is that ringing a bell, maybe? Some? Okay, all right. So in Nigeria, in his area, it's been infiltrated by Boko Haram, radical Muslim terrorists who do horrible things to people. They put them in cages, they burn them alive, they kidnap little girls, and they do horrible things with those little girls, and then they sell them to others so that they can do the horrible things. It's horrible, horrible, demonic organization. Well, there was a bishop in that area where they're doing all this stuff. He was at prayer, this bishop, Bishop Oliver Dome, before the Blessed Sacrament, and he was praying his rosary. And all of a sudden, and he gives testimony to this, when you go back to your dorm tonight, you can do a Google and you'll find the videos of him talking about what I'm about to tell you. He's at prayer, praying his rosary before the Blessed Sacrament, and Jesus appears to him. Now, this is a bishop telling the story. He's not lying to us. Guess what Jesus had in his hands? Our Jesus. The Jesus that you and I receive in Holy Communion, that we love, that we've given our lives to. Guess what he had in his hands? A sword. A sword. A sword of steel. That's my Jesus. Now, I'm not saying my Jesus is Conan or Braveheart or, but it was a sword. Our Jesus came with a sword to his bishop in an area that's plagued by radical Islamic terrorists. And he held out the sword to his bishop in a gesture of take it. He didn't say anything to him, but he held it out. And so the bishop went to take the sword. And as soon as he touched the sword, it was mystically transformed into a rosary. And Jesus then spoke to his bishop and said 3 times, Boko Haram is gone. Boko Haram is gone. Boko Haram is gone. After that, the bishop went and told his priest what happened, and he started rosary crusades. That was 2 years ago. Just 2.5 weeks ago, that bishop went on air in England and said that in his area in Nigeria, Boko Haram is almost all but vanquished because of this rosary weapon, this sword. In other areas of Nigeria, they're still there, Boko Haram, where they don't have the rosary crusades. Heaven spoke to him and to us. And that's what I want to go through tonight is, you see this in my hands, and it doesn't look like anything. It just looks like a wooden rosary. It's a really cool rosary, I have to admit. But it doesn't look intimidating. What damage could you do with this thing? Every now and then these things break in my pocket. They get snagged, and I got to get a new one. But what you can't see is what I'm holding in my hand right now. But God can see, and the angels can see, both the holy ones and the fallen ones. What they can see that I have in my hand right now is a sword of unbelievable power. You can't see it, but they can. It's here. Demons fear this thing. Nobody slays a dragon without a sword. That's what this is. And as you've heard in your theology classes, I'm sure, and from the preaching here, the whole bookends of human history are about what? From Genesis to Revelation, what's in that book? A woman doing battle against a serpent dragon. Lucifer, Satan, the devil. And is her divine offspring, her firstborn son, who conquers him. And her other offspring, you and me. God set this up this way. This is the bookends of human history, of everything. He knew that this woman that he made was going to be the one to crush Satan's face, and that she was going to be the one who would bring into the world the one who would give to us the saving sacred mysteries to slay the dragon. So, he was going to create a weapon, a special weapon. He could have done it at the beginning of time right away, but he chose to work throughout time and in his workshop. He was almost like acting like a blacksmith in a certain sense, forging a weapon that would be a Marian weapon for that chosen woman, that she could give it to her children and they could use it to cut off the heads of the wicked Hydra, 7-headed Hydra. You better have a very powerful sword if you're going to come up against a beast like that. So God works slowly, letting his church cooperate with him in this workshop of the Catholic Church. And there were things that would be called antecedents of the weapon. Because when you read a lot of books about the Rosary, a lot of the people are well-intentioned, but they don't do their research well. And they start regurgitating things that have been said by what I would call modernists, in the last 100 years especially, saying that the Rosary is of more human origin than divine origin, that we just kind of made it up. No. One of the greatest popes ever, Pope Leo XIII, said that the Rosary is of more divine origin than human origin. It was made by God. He crafted it. He forged it together. And at a specific moment in time, he unsheathed it and gave it to his woman so that she could then give it to her chosen servants. So it starts with the angelic salutation. when the Archangel Gabriel comes to Our Lady and says, "Hail, full of grace." And then the other component, St. Elizabeth's greeting to Our Lady, "Filled with the Holy Spirit. Blessed are you among all women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." And then we get the beautiful prayer from the lips of our Lord himself, the Our Father. What better prayer, could there be? And it slowly grows, and they don't come together till centuries. The Hail Mary prayer wasn't developed until the 6th and 7th century of the church, and a prayer in the liturgy. People were already praying the Our Father prayer, but the Hail Mary, it took time to come together. And then there was a certain thing in the church, in the divine blacksmith's workshop, of prayer beads. Did you know that St. Jerome, the great biblical scholar, used prayer beads to pray on? Not the Rosary, no. But there were many people during that time that used little pebbles or stones, and they would do their penance, their penitential prayers, Irish monks and others that would use this form to make sure they got their number of prayers in. And eventually they developed this, a beaded form of doing it. But none of these things had come together. They were slowly developing the antecedents of what would be the components of making this sword. There was even something that came into existence called the Marian Psalter. I don't know if you've heard of that, but there were, back in those times, when the monks came to pray the divine office, if they didn't know Latin, they couldn't do it. So many of them started to substitute the Our Father prayers, and they would pray 150 of them, and became known as the Pater Noster beads. And then the Cistercians, and their great love for Our Lady, with like St. Bernard of Clairvaux and others, they said, why don't we make a parallel also to honor the Virgin Mary? So we'll pray the Hail Marys on those beads as well. That became the Marian Psalter. But it wasn't a weapon. It didn't have any mysteries attached to it. It was something for monks who did a devotional form who couldn't participate in the Latin monastic hours. It wasn't for taking it out into the streets for an evangelical tool. Not yet. But then the 13th century came. And there was a lot going on in the 13th century. I'll start by telling you about a particular woman in Spain who was pregnant. Her name was Juana of Anza in Spain. She would become Blessed Jane of Anza. When she was pregnant with her son, she had a vision. And it's a weird vision. She was pregnant, and she saw herself giving birth to a dog. Yikes, right? Yeah, totally. I just saw some of your faces. You're like, wait, what? I know, whack. It was trying to portray something else. She didn't know what it meant at the time. Well, when she gave birth to her son, she named her son Dominic. Dominic would grow up to be very skilled in being able to speak. And so he became a priest. He became an Augustinian canon, which is basically a glorified diocesan priest back at those times. He was a diocesan priest who lived a certain way of life around the cathedral. In his time, there was a heresy in the church called Alba Gentian Ism, which was basically a dualistic understanding of life. Spiritual things, good. Material, fleshly things, bad. Therefore, Christianity, bad. Why would God become flesh? And it denied the incarnational truths of Christianity, and very specific ones. The birth of Jesus Christ, that Mary, was a virgin. All those fleshly realities they denied. Well, this particular priest, we'll call him Father Dominic at that point, he went on a preaching campaign to go against them. And he thought with his ability to speak, he'd be able to conquer them easily. But he wasn't able to. And he was pretty bummed out. So he went into the forest to do like a retreat in southern France. And he prayed and he asked heaven, I need help, I need help. And that is when tradition says, popes have said, Our Lady came to him and said to him, preach my Psalter. Remember the Psalter was already in existence. But it was not the Rosary. It was not a spiritual weapon. It had no meditations attached to it. The Mendicant orders were about to be born, and they would take the monastic Psalter out of the monasteries into the streets as an evangelical tool to bring the heretics back and to bring others to the truth. So when he was given this commission by the Blessed Virgin Mary, she told him that it would be a weapon. Some accounts say that she used the word battering ram against heresy. He went out and he converted so many people, brought people back to the faith. And then he founded a community, the Order of Preachers, to join him in this and to spread all around the world, the Dominicans. And you know what they became known as in Latin? Because, back then, the Latin phraseology, Dominicanis, the dogs of God. That was the vision that his mother had. That's why whenever you see an image of St. Dominic, you almost always see next to him a dog with a torch in its mouth. Because when she had that vision, the dog had a torch in its mouth and it leaped out of her womb and it went throughout the whole world, lighting the world on fire with the saving truth of Jesus Christ. So he founded the Dominicans, and they started to win souls back in an unbelievable pace. And then he died in 1221. And this still went by the name of the Psalter. It wasn't yet quite known universally as the Rosary. That would come, but it was called the Psalter still at that time. You know who was not a huge fan of this? Satan. He knew what had been unsheathed, that the queen had been given the weapon, and now it was in the world, and he was going to go on the attack. And he did. He did. Do you know what happened in the next century in Europe? The Black Plague, the Black Death. 1/3 of Europe died. Do you know how many people that was? Estimates are that it was as many as 25 million people died. Whoa. Why? Yes, it was because of rats infested things and so forth, and it spread, but there was a spiritual component. These are not my words, so don't write me up in the paper and say, Father says the plague is because we're, St. Louis de Montfort said it. Centuries later, in The Secret of the Rosary, he would say that the Black Death, the Black Plague in Europe in the 14th century was a result of Satan seeking to get rid of this. The weapon had been unsheathed. He wanted to destroy all documentary evidence associated with it. And by the way, this is a frequent tactic of the evil one. When some new form of devotion is given to the world, he will seek to burn the original documents. Look at almost any mystic and visionary who's given a chaplet of Divine Mercy, for example. St. Faustina burned her first version of her diary, and so many others. If you do the historical research, you'll see that Satan goes on the attack, and he did. St. Louis de Montfort says that he went on the attack because he knew that these infestations would go into convents, monasteries that had libraries, and those places would have to be burned because they were infested with the plague, and they were burned. They were. So many lost. And we don't have much of the original documents at all associated with this. As a matter of fact, we don't have one single word from St. Dominic. Did you know that? The guy founded the Order of Preachers who speak. We don't have one word historically preserved from the mouth of St. Dominic. Not one. Are we therefore supposed to think that he never talked? Of course not. He preached, that's what he did. He founded the Order of Preachers, the dogs of God. Satan was on the hunt for this. But when St. Dominic had died in 1221, he sent some of his brothers, right before his death, to England. That was a key move. Because you know what England became known as during that century of the Black Plague? The Dowry of Mary. You can look all this up historically. Why was it called that? For many reasons. One of which was this went off of mainland Europe to go for safekeeping during the plague that struck mainland Europe. Oh, it hit England too, but it ravaged mainland Europe. During the 14th century in England, colleges were founded where the presidents and founders of the colleges mandated that this be prayed by the students and the president. They would put these extra ones in little bowls at the entrances of churches, so if people didn't have their own, they could take one to use. The Dowry of Mary, kept safe offshore during the Black Death. So after that was over, in the next century, the 15th century, there was a renewal movement happening. And my brother friars here could tell you about this. The Observant Reform movement, where after people survived, many religious communities that were founded the century before or a century and a half before wanted to get back to the original charism of their founder, recover that original fire and everything. Franciscans were the first to start doing it. Then you had Dominicans follow, and you had a whole bunch of Servites and a whole bunch of others. And heaven started to speak to certain individuals about different forms of rosaries particular to their order. So you had the Brigittine rosary, given to St. Bridget of Sweden. You had the ancient Servite rosary, which, by the way, was also founded during the century of St. Dominic. How many of you have heard about Cabejo, Our Lady of Cabejo, right? We'll get into that a little later. It's an ancient rosary, the Seven Sorrows of Our Lady rosary. It was founded in the 13th century, right after Our Lady gave St. Dominic the original one. Well, the Servites said, we need to recover that. St. Bridget of Sweden was given visions. She was given a form of a rosary. And the Franciscans in the year 1422, this is Franciscan history here, was given to a novice named James, who was kind of bummed out because in the novitiate, he was not able to make wreaths to crown Our Lady with roses. And he felt disappointed that he wasn't able to do that. So Our Lady came to him, and she gave him a Franciscan form of a rosary, the Franciscan corona, the Franciscan crown rosary. And she specifically let him know that it was to be an understanding of crowning her with roses. And then it kicked in that all forms of Marian Psalters, whether they were the Dominican, Servite, Brigittine, Franciscan, would be known as rosaries. That's when it got the name. So, although it was originally given to St. Dominic, the church is perpetually grateful to the Franciscans for that vision given to that novice in the year 1422. And as the century progressed, the Dominicans fully surrendered to this movement, and one of them, living in Brittany, like the shore, northwest France, closest you can get to England, he started to receive visions, but he was an academic. And academics sometimes aren't too friendly towards these kinds of things. And so he thought, well, I'm involved with my books. I don't have time for this. And he was receiving visions, the tradition says, from Jesus, Mary, and St. Dominic, the founder of his community. And they were asking him to revive the Dominican rosary, the father of all rosaries. But he was reluctant until Jesus said to him on one occasion, I love this. Jesus said to him this is powerful stuff. He said, the world is filled with ravenous wolves, and you, unfaithful dog, know not how to bark. Yikes. How'd you like to be on the receiving end of that? Right? That's God saying that to you. It seems harsh, but it's not. Why would he call him an unfaithful dog? Because he's a Dominican. You are a son of St. Dominic. You are a Dominicanis. Why are you not barking against the wolves? You're in your books. You've got this weapon. So that's when he kicked it in gear. And he began to renew this, and he wrote books about it. And he renewed the confraternity that St. Dominic founded, even though it may have gone by a different name at the beginning, as an association of prayer. And there's actually, in my book, I have the references of how he set one up when he went to Rome, St. Dominic. He renewed this, the Confraternity of the Rosary, and people started joining. And another Dominican brother founded another one in 1475, Father Jacob Springer, and it spread everywhere, everywhere. But guess who wasn't liking it? Satan, the dragon. He knows the power that this has. And you're going to see this constant give and take. Satan is going to go on the attack to seek to destroy this. God, through his church and through his saints specifically, will try and resharpen the blade. It's going to happen in every century. So the next century, the 16th century, what happens? Well, lots of stuff, tons of stuff. But you've got a disgruntled man who leaves the priesthood, Martin Luther. He was a fallen away priest. And he marries a nun that he helped escape from the convent. And he had a confraternity rosary book that he owned. It's still in the library holdings at the University of Jena in Germany to this day. And in the margins, what do you see that he wrote? He hated this. Oh yes, there were certain parts of Our Lady that he still held to, but the rosary, oh no. He called it legendary, mythological, stupid work done for no one. Why? Because he was on the attack against indulgences, and this has indulgences attached to it. This was being prayed for souls in purgatory, and eventually him and those who came after him would get away from those aspects of our faith. And he slammed this thing. I'm not making this up. It exists today in the book that he owned in Germany. Whoa. You know, I'm not saying the guy was a Satanist, but the spirit behind what he was doing was not the Holy Spirit. And things continued with the game. God raised up phenomenal saints in what's called the Counter-Reformation. St. Charles Borromeo and St. Philip Neri, and you name it, so many. Even the Jesuits came into existence, and they founded the Sodality of Our Lady, the Jesuit counterpart to the confraternities of the Rosary, where they would seek to renew Catholic life and society by means of the Rosary. See, the Protestants tried to get rid of it, but they didn't do that at all. They actually made it flourish, because what happened? That was the century of the missionaries. The Jesuits, they went to India, and they went to the Far East and Asia, and the Dominicans and the Franciscans went to Central America, South America, and when they went across the high seas on those boats, did they bring big bulky tomes with them? No. Did they take huge liturgical items with them? No. They took the Bible on a set of beads, and they evangelized the world, and it worked. This is the essence of it all. And they knew it. And you know, beginning with the founding of this, I forgot to mention this, they saw this as a weapon to conquer the falsehoods. And to me, it's interesting that they wear it on their left. Most religious wear the rosary on their left if they have a habit. Do you know why that is? Because it comes out of the time of chivalry, when knights would unsheathe their sword. Most people are right-handed, not all, but most. You unsheath it from your left. That's why it's worn on the left side for almost all of religious who wear a rosary as part of their habit. When the Dominicans went to Mexico in 1525, do you know what happened 6 years later? Guadalupe. Europe was ditching the faith. Millions were leaving the one true faith. This did not make heaven happy. A gap had been created. And God basically said to Europe, you don't want it? Fine. I'll send my mother to a little nobody, Juan Diego, and within 10 years, he'll raise up 8 million to fill in the gap through this image, this Marian selfie that's given to the world. I really wish I could say I was the originator of that. Scott Hahn told me that. It was awesome. It's true, selfie, and she just left it there. So, transformed, conquered the false gods of the Aztecs and their human sacrifices. And did you know that 4 copies were made of the original and touched to it and sent back to Europe? One was given to the King of Spain, who a little later in the century would give it to a man named John Doria, who would be on a key battleship in the Bay of Greece called Lepanto. The Conquistadora came to the Americas and conquered the false gods of the Aztecs. Now she was going to go back to Europe and conquer radical Islam. Oh, you don't mess with her. She has power, my friends. She has power.